Hello all, and welcome to Biology 132. Bio 132 is the second in our majors level general biology sequence. So if you're in this class, it means you passed Bio 131 or a similar course somewhere else. And in 131, you hopefully came away with a lot of new knowledge. You would have learned about the nature of science, the process of science, right? How do we discover new knowledge? You would have learned something about the building blocks of life, both the chemical building blocks, biochemical building blocks, and cells. Right? What is it that makes something alive? What are the differences between living things and non-living things? How do organisms utilize energy? How do they undergo particular chemical reactions, things like photosynthesis and cellular respiration? And exchange. How does transport occur across membranes? You would have talked about characteristics that are common to all life, bacteria, plants, animals, humans, things like ribosomes and a universal language of DNA. You would have also talked about how cells reproduce. What does the cell cycle look like? So mitosis and then conversely meiosis. And how do genes become phenotypes? How are they expressed? How do we go from a stretch of nucleotides to a physical organism, right? And then now that we know all that stuff, how do we use it, right? Biotechnology and techniques that we use to manipulate genes and things like that. And these are all things that you talked about in Bio 131. And now, moving on, we're going to talk about these things from more of a zoomed out lens, right? So we're going to talk, instead of just about genetics in individuals and then, generation to generation of individuals, we're talking about genetics in populations, right? And that leads to a number of essential questions. This semester, we're going to talk about how new species arise, right? How do we go from one species to two species or to multiple species? And that raises the question, how then did the first species arise? Because it couldn't have arisen from other species. How are species related, and how do we use that to classify them? How do different organisms perform some of the essential functions of life? So things like gas exchange and metabolism, the breakdown of foods, movement, reproduction. Different organisms do these things slightly differently based on where they live and how large they are and what sort of pressures they have ecologically. And we're going to talk about different ways that those things occur. And then we're going to talk about how those organisms, all trying to perform those functions of life individually, affect one another, right? And how do abiotic factors like weather or sunshine, rainfall, the pH or chemistry of the soil, how those things impact life. In other words, we're going to talk about ecology. The last thing we're going to discuss this semester is not just how organisms and their environments interact, right, to affect one another's fitness, but how do we fit in that equation, right? How do we fit into the ecosystem? And we're going to talk a bit about conservation ecology. But we're going to start off talking about the basic idea that undergirds all of this, which is evolution. And you'll find that in chapter 22 of your text. Evolution, as defined by Darwin in The Origin of the Species, which was the first book where he laid out in extensive detail this idea, is descent with modification, meaning from one generation to the next, you have characteristics that are heritable. They get passed on from one generation to the next, but they can change just a bit and change in response to the environment, right? To what makes that organism more fit in its particular environment. Another way to define that would be the change in the genes of a population over time. But Darwin couldn't define it that way because Darwin did not know what genes were in 1859. Now, Darwin's ideas, as you may well know, were pretty radical. He caused a lot of controversy when he first put them forward. In fact, he waited a long time to actually publish his book because he knew what a firestorm it would be in a world where it was almost universally accepted that species were unchanging and the earth was very young and every species had been made exactly as it is now by God. But while it was a revolutionary idea, it does have a lot of deep historical roots. He didn't come out with this idea out of nowhere. In the late 1700s, a geologist named Hutton proposed an idea of gradualism. And this was the idea that a lot of the big geological features that we see could have been formed by processes slowly over time that we're familiar with. So, for instance, the Grand Canyon could have been carved out by the Colorado River via erosion over a long period of time. And he led to geologists like Lyell, who said, well, maybe those processes are still going on. And he put forth the idea that all of the processes that helped maybe create the world way back in ancient history are still in effect today. And the same laws of physics that we can measure today, things like gravity, were also in operation back then, right? So it's not like things were extraordinarily different back then, and now in modern times we have different laws of physics, right? And Lyell, his book Principles of Geology had been published shortly before Darwin went on his big voyage in the Beagle, and he had a copy of it with him, and it was a big influence on him. Darwin was not even the first person to put forward the idea of evolution. In fact, someone named Lamarck had published a hypothesis of evolution early in the 1800s, far before Darwin. His idea was just wrong, and we'll talk about that in a bit. It wasn't the fact of evolution that was wrong, it was the mechanism that he proposed that was not correct. So a lot of things were going on before Darwin came up with his idea of evolution by natural selection. Cuvier had published fossils. The idea of extinction wasn't really around until not that long before Darwin, right? Cuvier helped make science aware that, well, there are species that used to be around that aren't around anymore, right? We had this view of unchanging species entirely until him. And while Darwin was the first, well, he's sort of the most famous person to put forward the idea of evolution by natural selection, there was another biologist at the same time who co-published the first paper with Darwin named Wallace. And Alfred Russel Wallace had his own voyage in a different part of the world, the Malay Archipelago. And he noticed a lot of the same things that Darwin did that we'll talk about here shortly, and came to the same conclusion. They actually shared credit in the initial paper, but Darwin had been putting his ideas together for decades, had a lot more detail, a lot more evidence, and was able to publish the book shortly after they published the papers, and so he tends to get the credit, but Alfred Russel Wallace deserves much of the credit for evolution by natural selection as well. As far back as the Old Testament and ancient Greece, what we know now as biologists, but what were considered in ancient Greek times as philosophers, right, who studied sort of everything, viewed species as fixed. And Aristotle was one of the first people to do a lot of writing on this in Scala Naturae. On through to the 17th century, species were still viewed as fixed. Carolus Linnaeus was a very famous naturalist of that time, and he was the person who began grouping species sort of in the way that we see them today. So he grouped them based on similarities of characteristics, mostly physical characteristics, and he founded this idea of taxonomy and binomial nomenclature, so genus species. So we are Homo sapiens, for instance. Homo meaning our genus, sapiens being our species. We are currently the only species in our genus, though that was not always the case. And Carolus Linnaeus believed species were fixed, but he was very good at describing and categorizing organisms into groups. by physical characteristics, and the way he separated out organisms into taxa looks very similar to the way that we now look at the evolutionary history of organisms, where organisms that have a common ancestor more recently, they tend to be more similar. And Carolus Linnaeus had grouped them into their own genus together, right? He had them grouped more closely together.